Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the webinar Tackling Complex ADA Issues. My name is Laura Alaniz and I'm here with Devin Vasquez, and we're going to present today. So for today's webinar, what we're going to talk about is what steps should an employer take when an employee requests an accommodation under the ADA. We'll also discuss when may an employer ask an employee about his or her medical condition. And lastly, what can an employer ask about an employee's medical condition?
So delving into the first topic, before we, go through the steps, we want to give you some background about the ADA. So the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits covered entities from discriminating against job applicants and employees on the basis of a disability. It applies to businesses who employ 15 or more employees who work 20 or more calendar weeks per year. Also applies to employment agencies, labor organizations, and joint management committees. The ADA protects, as I mentioned, the ADA protects employees and applicants who are disabled, as defined by the ADA, qualified for the position held or sought, and can perform the essential functions of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation. So when you're looking to determine if an employee is qualified, typically consideration will be given to the employer's judgment, what the fundamental job duties are, and a written description. So it is very useful when you have a written description to rely on rather than just suddenly making up the description. But the more complex issue that tends to be sparsed about is the definition of disability. So the ADA defines an individual with a disability as one who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity of the individual, a record of having such an impairment, or one who has been regarded as having such an impairment. When the ADA was amended in 2008, it expanded on what qualifies as disabled. So while it is a hot area of contesting, frequently most people who attempt to can qualify as an individual with a disability. But if you do decide to get into whether or not they're disabled and you're looking to whether or not their impairment restricts them, look to whether or not it affects one of the following major life activities. So it's really just a fundamental caring for yourself, walking, talking. If it impairs your ability to do any of those things, then it will likely be considered a disability. So the ADA's application extends to really all areas of employment, from the beginning to the job application, the hiring, advancement and discharge, the compensation, job training, and the miscellaneous other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. These are some common examples of disability discrimination in the workplace that you should keep in mind. So for example, the using discriminatory test standards or selection criteria that can include the test itself or the way that they're administered in a way that could filter out certain individuals with a disability. The examples also include these improperly conducting medical examinations or inquiries, which we'll get into more a bit later, entering into discriminatory contracts, which could frequently arises with employment agencies. So employment agencies may not honor any discriminatory employer preferences. That would also qualify as a violation of the ADA. The largest one that comes into play, though, is failing to make a reasonable accommodation to the known physical or mental limitations of an employee or applicant.
And these days, that last one is what we're really seeing a lot of claims involving is an employer's failure to make an unreasonable accommodation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what an accommodation is and go through that process.
So, what is a reasonable accommodation? It's a modification or an adjustment to allow an employee or applicant to apply for the position, perform the essential job functions, and or enjoy benefits and privileges of employment.
So an accommodation is not an excuse to take an extra day off. Now, what we've put up in this slide is from a recent study by Career Builder that found that 35% of employees called in sick when they felt fine. Some of the employees called in because they just didn't want to go to work. That was 26%. Some needed time to relax. That was about 22%. Some needed to catch up on sleep. That was 17%. Some took off a day to run some personal errands. That was about 10%. And only about 25% legitimately had an illness or a doctor's appointment. According to this study, employers were finding that employees most often called in during the months of December, followed by July and January. And surprise, surprise, the most popular day of the week to call in sick was Monday, followed by Friday. So these stats show that, employees may abuse the system. However, even if they're abusing the system, as employers, we still have to be mindful and parse through the excuses that don't seem valid to the ones that may have a grain of truth that we may actually have to see if an accommodation is needed. Now, what if you get some excuses like employee said the ozone in the air flattened his tires, or the employee had to keep her hair appointment because her roots were showing and she looked like a mess, or employee was ill after eating cat food instead of tuna, or employee was experiencing traumatic stress from a large spider found in her home, or ate too much birthday cake. Or one I've even heard is, I went to my doctor and he says I was lacking in vitamin D, so I had to go to the beach. Now, these excuses may seem completely ridiculous on their face, and some of them really are ridiculous. However, some of them, for example, like the last one, which seemed completely ridiculous, does disclose a medical condition, and when some of the excuses, there's maybe a medical condition embedded in them, at what point as an employer do we need to explore further and see if we need to look into an accommodation?
So just because an employee presents a excuse doesn't mean that you are necessarily required to accommodate them. The ADA provides that covered entities must make reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities who are applicants or employees, unless they can show that providing that accommodation would impose an undue hardship on their business operation. So if and when you're presented with an accommodation request, we recommend you consider first whether or not you as the employer are a covered entity. Second, whether the individual is protected by the ADA. And third, whether the accommodation will impose an undue hardship on the employer's business operation. We've already discussed 1 and 2, so right now I'd like to focus a little bit more on the third, of when does an accommodation impose an undue hardship. An undue hardship could be defined as an action requiring significant difficulty or expense. We're looking for accommodations that would require a significant financial difficulty, accommodations that are unduly extensive or disruptive, ones that fundamentally alter the nature of the operation of the business. So when you're trying to determine if it is in fact an undue hardship, fortunately the ADA has provided us with sub-factors to consider. So you'll want to look at the type of organization, the number, type, location of facilities, the geographical separateness, administrative or fiscal relationship of the facility in question to the covered entity. So that would be something where it's a large corporation and they have many locations and offices, like a bank, for instance, will have different branches. You'll also look at the number of employees employed at the facility at issue versus nationwide. So going on that bank example, if you have one branch that only employs 2 or 3 employees, whereas the headquarters, it has 50, and the person seeking an accommodation is at that one branch that has 2 or 3 employees, it might be a bit difficult for you to, for example, grant a leave as an accommodation, since then you'd be down to just 1 or 2 employees.
And as the larger employer you are, the EEOC will consider that you maybe have more resources to provide greater accommodation than a smaller one. For example, if you're a big employer like Ford, and the request is to change up a workstation and make some significant modification to a workstation, Ford may be able to afford that. But if you're a small employer that maybe has 20 employees, and you may not have the resources to make that same accommodation that Ford can. And so, unfortunately, with the undue hardship, you really have to delve into the details and really look at the employer and their capabilities when determining what's an undue hardship. And an undue hardship for one employer may not be an undue hardship for another employer.
And on that note about the accommodation, the ADA really focuses on the nature and cost of the accommodation requested, and how that would impact the entity's financial resources and their budget to even accommodate such a thing. So all of those are things to consider when you're evaluating whether or not you can provide that accommodation. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that all accommodation requests are reasonable. These are some examples of accommodations that are typically considered reasonable. Altering your facility to make it readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. Some degree of job restructuring, modifying work schedules, reassigning individuals to vacant positions if there are any, acquiring or modifying equipment or devices, modifying examinations, training materials or policies, and providing qualified readers or interpreters.
Now, unfortunately, with these accommodations, it's really going to depend on the company on whether or not these will be reasonable for that particular company. If you have a particular job position that has multiple employees in that same job position, and you can interchange employees, then you may be able to do, say, a modified work schedule and have one employee do, the morning and the other one do the afternoon. You have more flexibility. But if you're a smaller employer that only has one person in that particular job, modifying a work schedule just may not be feasible, may not be reasonable for that particular employer. So a lot of these, while they may be examples of accommodations, not all employers will these be reasonable for the other employers.
Exactly. It's definitely necessary to consider those factors that we discussed when looking at the undue hardship. But also, these are examples of accommodations that are generally considered to be unreasonable. Things like eliminating essential job functions or job duties from an employee's job, purchasing personal equipment like glasses, hearing aids, walking canes, lowering quality or production standards, or displacing another employee, or similar things that would negatively affect another employee. So when you're considering about the accommodation, you look at factors that we discussed, but these are generally ones that you can rely on as being unreasonable.
And one that's been coming up a lot is leave as an accommodation. And when somebody asks for indefinite leave, that is typically considered an unreasonable accommodation. An employer does not have to give an employee just time off for an extended period of time without any determination of how long that's going to be. But then we're going to talk about a little bit later as when it can be a reasonable accommodation, what the employee will need to disclose to you and provide information for you to determine whether it actually is a reasonable accommodation. All right, so let's now move on to when is it appropriate to ask about an employee's medical condition. So when looking into when you can ask about an employee's medical condition, what you need to keep in mind before you ask is the examination or inquiry, is it job related? Is it consistent with a business necessity? So those are the factors you need to keep in mind before you start asking about an employee's medical condition. So let's go through a couple of examples. What if an employee comes and discloses that she needs some surgery and requests 4 weeks off? That seems like a pretty basic request, and surgery, that's obviously a medical condition, and they're giving you a definite time of 4 weeks. In some instances, that may be a completely reasonable request. What I would be careful about is you don't really need to know the details of the surgery. You just need to know enough that it's an actual surgery and get a doctor to sign off on it and get some medical information, but you don't need to know the complete details about it. Now, one thing you will need to know, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is that when they're taking time off for the surgery and they say they only need 4 weeks off, you are going to need to know what they're going to be capable of when they return, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that may be time to ask about getting a medical certification. So what if an employee tells you that his doctor recommends that he should work from home because he has a condition? An example like that, they don't really tell you what that condition is. You don't know if it's a medical condition. You have no idea what that is. And in that scenario, it would be appropriate because the employee is asking for an accommodation. And so in that instance, it would be you would need to know, well, what exactly is this condition and what kind, and this request to work from home, is that actual or reasonable? So you'll need to know a little bit more about this condition and what limitations this condition is causing to see if working from home actually is supposed to actually benefit and helps them perform their essential functions, to evaluate whether or not you can provide this type of accommodation.
That would also be necessary to know if they're even capable of performing their essential job duties. If they're not, then you get to the different topic of they're no longer protected under the ADA if they cannot perform their job duty.
And just remember, this is just an initial inquiry. You're just finding out what they're looking for, what the condition is, because later on you may need to do the evaluation of, okay, he's asking for this, it's legitimate, but as an employer, can I really provide that accommodation that he's asking for? So if an employee comes calling in sick at least once a week for a month, but you don't really know the nature of the illness, why they're calling in sick, maybe they're just being a slacker, you have no idea. Is it appropriate at that point to start asking for some information? And in that scenario, I think it would be. If they're consistently calling in sick for a month, now you don't want to go into too many details, but this may be a scenario where you're saying, hey, is there something that you need? You seem to be taking some time off. Do we need to give you some FMLA paperwork? So you got to be careful, and we'll talk about a little more detail on how to phrase it. But that might be an instance where you may need to inquire in deeper because something's going on with this employee that they're missing so much time off of work. So what can you ask about an employee's medical condition? You can ask about an employee's ability to perform their job-related functions. And if it's job-related and consistent with business necessity, then you can inquire as to whether the employee is an individual with a disability, and as to the nature and severity of the disability. But we're going to talk a little bit about how much of the nature and severity of the disability that you can really ask about. So what can you ask? You could ask, do you need to take a medical leave of absence? Would you like me to provide you with FMLA paperwork? Now, these type of questions are okay because you're not specifically asking about the details, but there's something going on that triggers that, oh, something's going on. Do you need us to provide you with some sort of accommodation or leave? And so these are good ways to ask it without getting into too much detail. And through the forms, you may be able to figure out what's going on with this employee. You can also ask, is there a reason why you're having difficulty performing the essential functions of your job? So if you notice an employee that is starting to have job performance issues and seems to be missing a lot of time off of work, it may be appropriate at that point to really delve into, well, you seem to be having problems performing your job. Why is that? And inquiring into that. And so the more you keep that inquiry job focused, during that interaction, you may find out what's going on with this employee, and if their problems on the job is because of a medical condition. And then one of the other things you can ask is, was your absence due to a medical condition? Now, here's a few other ones that are appropriate that won't buy you a lawsuit. So do you want to discuss an accommodation for a condition that affects your ability to perform your essential functions of your job? Now that question is appropriate, but I would caution when you ask that question. For some employees, they won't have an issue with you asking that question. Some employees may not want to admit they have an issue, and you asking that question may get them very defensive and go, what do you mean? Do you think I have a disability? So while this is a fairly innocuous question, again, you got to be careful of the situation and what context you're doing that. Can you provide a doctor's note confirming your recent absence was due to a medical condition? Again, we kind of talked about that. When you have maybe an employee that's been calling out sick a lot, then maybe the way to address that and to figure out what's going on is to ask for a note confirming that their absence was due to a medical condition. And then, of course, if they've been gone a lot, for the example where they've been out in surgery, that, you know, can you provide a doctor's note confirming you can safely resume your work duties? Those would be appropriate questions. Now, here's what you can ask. What are you going to the doctor for? Do you have a heart condition? Do you have asthma or any other difficulties breathing? How many days were you sick? I think for most of you that's pretty obvious. You know, I know I shouldn't be asking that. So we definitely would advise don't ask those kind of questions because those are the ones that may get you into trouble. So let's move on to talking about some questions that also may not seem that bad but can get you into trouble, especially if you're involved in you're doing a job interview. So if you ask the question of, have you ever filed for workers' compensation? Have you ever been injured on the job? Have you been treated for mental health problems? What prescription drugs are you currently taking? All those questions may very well also get you into trouble, and you may get a lawsuit, because if you're asking these questions, you're sort of probing into a person's potential disability, and then if you decide not to hire that person, they may think that you didn't hire them because you were found out that they had a disability. So let's go over some tips for asking about an employee's medical condition. The general rule is you can ask an employee to disclose information about any health conditions that arise during employment. So generally you can ask about that. However, you can ask about a medical condition if that condition is affecting the employee's ability to do their job. When you do ask those questions, Make sure they're narrowly defined, and definitely focus on the need for the accommodation, not the condition itself. And so when I say narrowly defined, you really want to keep those questions focused to the job itself and kind of keep it job related, because the more details you try to get out the condition may kind of skate the line of are you asking for too much information that could potentially get you into trouble. And definitely do not ask employees, the medical provider, for their medical records or information about their health without the permission of the employee. In fact, it's better to get the employee to give you that information and not directly interact with a doctor, except of course if you need to clarify what's on the medical form that was provided. But even when you do need clarification on what is on the form, make sure you stick to simple clarification and not ask for more information. If you do need more information, get the employee to get that for you, because the more you interact with a doctor, there may be some issues that you're trying to get too much into the learning about the person's disability, and you want to avoid that.
So these are some commonly asked questions that we've been presented with about the ADA. The first one that seems to come up a lot is whether or not an accommodation request needs to be in writing. This is, I think, one of the few questions where there's a clear answer, and the answer is no. The employee has no obligation to make a request in writing. We do recommend, though, that employers document the date, extent of the request, and every conversation along the interactive process.
And on that note, we know they don't have to request in writing, but how is an employer supposed to figure out whether an accommodation is needed? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that question. Sometimes you're going to get employees that will come to you and be very straightforward and tell you exactly what you need, and of course you want to follow up with some forms to get the information you need to determine if accommodation is needed. But if you get an employee that you think something's going on and they may need an accommodation, how do you deal with that scenario without them becoming defensive, like I mentioned earlier, on what, you assuming I have a disability? And those are not easy situations to deal with. But we do recommend, as I kind of mentioned earlier, remembering those tips of maybe you don't ask specifically as to if there's a condition that's affecting their performance, but talk to that employee about what issues you're noticing, and if it's performance related, talk to them about their performance related condition and say, what's going on? You're having issues doing this. Is there a reason? Is there something we as an employer can do to help you improve your performance? So that type will help you not necessarily get into the details or offend them by asking too much, but may get you information that you need to determine if this person may need an accommodation without asking too much.
Right, so on that note, and I guess applying to the second question, an employer's duty to provide an accommodation is not triggered until they're aware that an accommodation is necessary. So an employer is not required to go around guessing or speculating whether or not an employee has a disability or needs an accommodation. But I would caution you in circumstances when you're going to take an adverse job action based on the perception that the person is physically or mentally unable to do their job. That might be something where you want to ask some of the questions that Laura detailed earlier. So when can an employer ask if the employee needs an accommodation? If the employer knows that the employee has a disability, then it may ask if they need an accommodation in some circumstances. If they reasonably believe that the employee may need an accommodation, then then you may ask. Additionally, the employer can ask if they need an accommodation if the employee who they know has a disability is having performance or conduct problems. So those are two clear clear times when you may engage in that process. Another commonly asked question that we encounter is whether or not the employer is required to provide the exact accommodation requested. And here the ADA highly encourages an interactive process between the employer and the employee. So once the employee asks for an accommodation or the interactive process begins somehow, the employer can go back and forth with the employee based on their ability to provide such an accommodation, whether or not it's reasonable, and you can essentially negotiate what is feasible for them to do.
And so, on that point, this is the hard part, is when you're engaging this interactive discussion, but you don't, as an employer, don't want to be perceived as you're asking for too much. So when we talked earlier about keep the inquiry job focused, that's going to be a good guiding principle when you're asking and engaging in this interactive discussion. So as an employer, you don't need to know, what the details are of the condition, but you do need to know what the condition is causing. What are those limitations? Because the more you know about the limitations, you can determine, one, if the accommodation they're asking for is reasonable, and if you can't do what they're asking for, is there something else as an employer you can do? But you're not going to know that until you know exactly what the limitations are. Let's say somebody needs frequent breaks due to a condition. So you need to know what it is that those limitations so you can see if that's something that you can even provide for that employee.
As Laura alluded to earlier, another commonly asked question is leave from work a reasonable accommodation? Generally speaking, yes, leave can be a reasonable accommodation. The amount of time for leave, though, will vary on whether or not it's reasonable based on the length of time and it's specific per employer.
Right.
And so you'll need to reflect on all of those other factors that we talked about for undue hardship to consider whether or not it is reasonable for you to provide.
And so for an example, if you have, we kind of mentioned this earlier, if you're a small employer and you only have one employee that does that particular job, and that employee comes to you and says, I need 6 months off due to my condition and I need leave as an accommodation. An employer that is small, that can't just readily change out that employee and put somebody else in their place, in that scenario, leave may not be reasonable for that particular employer, and they may not be able to provide it. However, if you're a large employer that has multiple people that perform that same job functions, and you can have other employees fill in while that person's on leave, for that particular employer, that accommodation may be reasonable. So, it's really important to really parse down and look at what the position is, who is available to fill in when that employee is gone, and then for how long as an employer are you able to do that. And so those are kind of the factors you have to consider when you're looking at whether leave as an accommodation is reasonable for that particular employer.
Now, what about if you do grant medical leave? What can you ask an employee when they return from leave?
So, we kind of mentioned this before, and here's the time we really want to talk about this is, the guiding principle is you don't need to know all the details, but you do need to know if that employee, when they come back, can they perform their essential functions of their job. And the best way to do that is when they're returning from leave, say, before you come back, I need you to fill out this work certification. And when you have that work certification, Don't just do some generic form, because oftentimes a doctor will just fill it out and say, yep, they can return to work. But that doesn't help you as an employer determine whether they can do all of their job functions. So that's why it's important, when we talked about early on, to have that job description that you can attach to that work certification and have that doctor certify that they can come back and do all the essential functions of their job. If you don't do that, it's going to be real hard for you as an employer to ask more details if you didn't kind of ask for it up front before they got back to work.
So those are some commonly asked questions that we've encountered. Are there any questions that you all have about what we've discussed today?
One of the topics that we did kind of want to discuss that we didn't really talk about is kind of the safety. We kind of touched on that.
Yes. So what if a employee has a disability that may pose a risk or a safety risk? Are you required to still hire them? And for that, the ADA provides an exception called the direct threat. So you look at whether or not the employee can safely perform their job duties. If they cannot, then you are not required to hire them, or you may make an employment decision based on that factor.
Right. And so again, it's very much you look at what the job is, and as long as you can show the business necessity and it's job related, then you can justify why you can't take a certain action like hiring them.
Another question that we've come across is whether or not you're allowed to ask an employee to take a drug test during their employment. The ADA does not consider drug tests to be a medical examination, so it really steps away from that. I believe it specifically says it doesn't endorse or prohibit, but it's not regulated by the ADA, so that would not be considered an impermissible medical examination or inquiry.
All right. Well, we've kind of covered everything, and if you want to email in some questions for us, because unfortunately with this area, it's just so specific to your particular scenario, and as employers, it's really difficult that it's not cookie cutter. You can't just say, if this happens, here's what I do. It's so much of it is going to depend on the circumstance, what they're asking for. Just kind of end this a little bit is when you get those questions and you're just not sure, those factors that we talked about to keep in mind are definitely, if I keep my inquiry job focused and I'm focusing on why they can't do their job, or how I can help them perform their job, if you keep that in mind when you're asking the questions, that will help you delve into not getting into too much detail of the specifics of their condition, and it's less likely to get into trouble.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we finished up early. We went faster than we thought we would. Thank you so much for participating, and obviously if you have any questions, just email that to us and we'll be happy to answer those for you.